Welcome back. In this section, we are going to be exploring hormones coming from the adrenal cortex. Now, notice I said cortex. Earlier, we've already talked about the adrenal medulla, which released catecholamine, specifically mostly epinephrine with some norepinephrine and just a titch of dopamine. Here we are talking the outer part of the adrenal gland, the adrenal cortex. And when we look at the adrenal cortex, there are actually 3 layers, and each layer is responsible for different hormones. So the outermost layer, the zona glomerulosa, gives us what we call mineralocorticoids, and there's only one of those, and it is aldosterone, and that's the first hormone we'll talk about. Going deeper, the next layer, the zona fasciculata, gives us our glucocorticoids, which is cortisol. So if you know cortisol, or if you've heard of cortisone, that's like the cousin of cortisol. So that's where that comes from. And then the deepest layer, the zona reticulata, gives us our androgens. And so the androgens basically go and they form testosterone, and then you get estrogen and progesterones from there. So we say, like, the deeper you go, the sweeter it is. On the outer part of the cortex, we have our salt hormone. Deeper to that, we have our sugar hormone. And deeper to that, we're going to have our sex hormones. And we make these sex hormones in our adrenal cortex our entire life. So little boys and little girls are all making testosterone and estrogens their entire lives. After puberty, we switch to our gonads to have massive amounts of hormones, estrogen and progesterone. If you're female, testosterone if you're male. But even if you're male, your adrenal cortex is still making estrogen. And if you're female, your adrenal cortex is still making testosterone. So I'm not going to talk any more about androgens and sex hormones, because we will talk a lot about them in both the male and female reproductive system lectures. So, talking about the outermost part of the adrenal gland, the mineralocorticoid, there's only one. Its name is aldosterone. And the stimulus for aldosterone secretion is having a low blood pressure and or a low blood volume, because low blood volume gives you low blood pressure. But if you have low blood pressure without a low blood volume, it still will kick out aldosterone. And so your body recognizes this, and the adrenal cortex kicks out aldosterone. So what does aldosterone do? It makes the kidney reabsorb sodium. So the sodium that would have been coming out in your urine now goes back into your blood. And what always follows salt? Water. And so the amount of water in your urine decreases. It gets reabsorbed into your blood, thereby increasing your blood volume, thereby increasing your blood pressure. So practice your negative feedback loop on this, and if you have any problems, just like I've said multiple times, be sure to contact me or discuss it in your study group. So I want to let you know, coming soon, we're going to be talking more about aldosterone because it's being affected by things happening in the kidney, liver, and lungs. And the aldosterone from the adrenal gland will affect the kidneys. And if a lot of aldosterone effects sound very similar to antidiuretic hormone, well, they kind of do. And we have this whole axis that we're going to talk about in great detail once we get to the urinary system. All right, going deeper into the zona fasciculata, our glucocorticoid is cortisol. And the first thing to understand about cortisol, it has what we call a diurnal release. In other words, there's times of the day where levels are normally high and normally low. And so your body starts kicking out aldosterone in the wee hours of the morning, and it usually peaks around the time you get up in the morning. And then throughout the morning, it lowers, and it's really quite low by the time you hit your mid-afternoon slump. And it continues going down as long as there's any daylight until around midnight, at which time it starts creeping back up. So there are a lot of specific physiological effects of cortisol, and I've kind of written some pathways here for you to understand it if you want to. But the Sparks note, the bottom right corner, and this picture, big effect of cortisol. It breaks down protein. So it decreases your muscle mass. Not a good thing. It also causes increased glucose in the blood. So increased cortisol levels, diabetics, bad news. Okay. Well, most of you have heard about cortisol from people having cortisone injections at the site of injury because, yes, it suppresses the immune response. So at a site of injury, if you're going to decrease the inflammatory response, fine. But systemically, you don't want to suppress your immune response because that means you're much more prone to infections and other bad things going on. And cortisol also decreases the last part of the inflammatory response where we have normal tissue repair to return you back to homeostasis. And that all has to do with the collagen synthesis. So you have poor wound healing. Wounds are likely to break open. All right, so cortisol production from the adrenal cortex. How do we get it? Well, remember, president, manager, worker. So the hypothalamus kicks out a releasing hormone known as corticotropin releasing hormone, which then acts on the adenohypophysis, which releases adrenocorticotropic hormone, which in the blood then goes to the adrenal cortex and has that kick out cortisol. Now, there are other ways that we can cause this to be stimulated, for instance, when we take our caffeine, or if you're having your mid-afternoon, early evening swim, go out and exercise. The more intense you are or the longer you do it, the higher your cortisol production will be. If you have a lot of mental anxiety or actually physical exhaustion. So there are ways that we kind of play with this diurnal variation. So once again, practice your negative feedback loops and let me know if you're having difficulty or work them out together in your study groups. So too much cortisol gives us what is known as Cushing's syndrome. And it could be because your body is making too much, or it could be because you're taking this steroid by mouth for whatever reason. Like, for instance, people who have acute asthma attacks are often put on prednisones, which is this type of a steroid. And so if you're on massive doses for either you have an autoimmune disease or certain other diseases, then you can get Cushing's syndrome from this exogenous source. If it's due to a pituitary tumor, and the way you can tell it's due to a pituitary tumor is because you would have high levels of the adrenocorticotropic hormone coming from the pituitary, then we call it Cushing's disease and not just the syndrome. So the big thing about Cushing's syndrome with too much cortisol is it screws up your carbohydrate and your protein metabolisms. And so we have all this problem with protein breakdown and with high blood sugar levels. So the people with Cushing's syndrome typically have what we call a moon faces. It becomes very round. You often have this little buffalo hump of fat back there. They have increased hair growth, especially ladies on their face may have to start shaving. And one other very important thing is, you know, the stretch marks that you get, like when you have growth spurts or pregnant ladies get on their abdomen. Well, this is a picture of a man with it. I took a man, you can tell that because he's got a really hairy abdomen and he's wearing man's pants. With his stretch marks, they're called striae. And the reason why you get them is because the protein, the collagen in the skin is being disrupted. So there are a whole bunch of other effects in case you're interested, but I'm not going to talk about anything else. Now, the opposite of Cushing's syndrome would be Addison's disease. If it's primary due to an adrenal problem, the vast majority of those are going to be autoimmune diseases. And it's different than if it's a secondary adrenal insufficiency, which would be a problem with either the hypothalamus giving us low CRH or the adenohypophysis giving us low ACTH. This is also what happens with people if you've been taking a lot of exogenous cortisol steroids. What happens is you turn off your negative feedback loop, and so your CRH levels and your ACTH levels normally plummet because you don't need to stimulate your own because you're taking extra. And if all of a sudden you went cold turkey and quit taking them, well, your hypothalamus and your adenohypophysis, they're not kicking anything out because they haven't had to kick anything out for a while. Okay, they're on siesta. They're wherever they are. They're taking a snooze fast. And so that can lead you to an acute Addison's disease, which is why people who are on steroids for a prolonged time have to be tapered over a long time so that their body will normally start kicking out more CRH and ACTH. So there's pictures here showing what happens with chronic hypoadrenalism or Addison's diseases. If the entire adrenal cortex is lost, then you're going to have difficulty with all three of the adrenal cortex hormones. So the classic signs and symptoms of Addison's disease are kind of interesting, and one of the most important things has to do with the person looks like they just come back from a great vacation in Greece or wherever, because they have this beautiful bronze color to the skin. And here's the reason why for that. When we look at the structure of ACTH and we look at the amino acids, the first three amino acids of ACTH are exactly the same as the hormone that stimulates the production of melanin. And so your body recognizes this, and so this leads to an overproduction of melanin, thereby giving you your skin darkening, making you look like you're healthy when in fact you're very unhealthy. And a biggie with Addison's is that there's hypoglycemia, especially if you are fasting. You can have low blood pressure, but the biggest is at times of stress, your body will never be kicking out cortisol production. So this was a huge concern because one of our presidents had Addison's, and that was JFK. So if you go back and you think about his presidency, was there any times of stress? Well, have you ever heard of the Cuban Missile Crisis and all those kinds of things? Yes, there was a lot of stress. He actually never traveled unless he had a physician with him who could give him his injections, because at times of stress, he was unable to cope whatsoever, and he could have easily died. So here's where we have come, because we are done dealing with hormones from the adenohypophysis. So what we learned from the adenohypophysis going up to the present in the hypothalamus, we talked about growth hormone, releasing hormone, giving us growth hormone, which had effect on the liver, bones, muscle, and adipose tissue. We talked about thyrotropin releasing hormone, which caused thyroid stimulating hormone from the adenohypophysis, and then that gave us T3 and T4 from the thyroid, which had its effect in various places in the body, especially metabolic rate. And then we talked about corticotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, which gave us adrenal corticotropin hormone from the adenohypophysis, which from the adrenal cortex gave us cortisol, and we talked about its effect on the body as well. So with that, we are done with this section, but we still have one final section to talk about for the endocrine system, but we are done with flat pig for now. Thank you, and I will see you shortly for the last video.